Hi there, welcome to Passion for Fashion, Class 1A. This is where we begin our journey into learning everything we're going to be learning about garment making in this course. Remember, this course is for beginners. And so in Class 1A, we're going to be looking at the subject of measurements, dimensions, and geometry. Before you begin anything, you need to know measurements. You need to know what to measure and you need to know how to measure. You also need to know how the measuring tape is calibrated. You need to know what part of the measuring tape you want to use, because when you look at the measuring tape, it has two parts. There's a part of inches and there's a part of centimeters. I work in Nigeria, and in this part of the world we usually use inches. So you are going to be familiarizing yourself with the measuring tape and how the measuring tape is calibrated. We're also going to be discussing the subject of dimensions. After you measure, how do you actually use what you have measured? Because a lot of the measurements that we take when we want to make garments are lengthwise measurements. Is that you're measuring the circumference of the bust, waist, and hip. You're measuring the length of the dress, length of back, length of sleeve, the bicep, the circumference of the arm, and things like that. So they are all lengthwise measurements. We're going to be using the SI unit for measurements, which is in meters. We don't really use centimeters in Nigeria. We use inches. And so for the course of this training, we're going to be focused on inches. At this time, we go straight into the next segment where we familiarize ourselves with the measuring tape and the calibration of the measuring tape so that we can understand how to use it to take proper measurements. All right, we have our measurement tape, and this is the part of the inches. You see the calibration and the marks on the tape. First, you have 1 inch, and next you have 2 inches afterwards. And after 2 inches, you go to the next one. You have 3 inches at the next one, and then you go to the next one and you have 4 inches. But then you would observe there are some shorter lines. The shorter one that is in between is 1/2 inch. What you have here is 1/2 inch. Now the next one is 1 inch. Then if you measure and mark in between, that's 1.5. The one in between, now this is 1.5. The next one is then 2 inches. And then if you follow through to the next one, that's 2.5. That's the one in between the two long marks. But there are some tinier lines, you see these smaller ones in between. So this is 1, 2. That tiny line is 1.25. That's 1 inch and quarter. 1 and 2, that's 1 inch and quarter. That small part is 1/4 of an inch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So those 8 marks are 1 inch. So 2 parts of that is 1/4 of an inch. So that's 1.5. That's 1.75. And then you have that's 1.75, and then you have 2 inches. So this is basically how the measuring tape is calibrated. So you have 1 inch, you have 1.25, you have 1.5. Yeah, that's it. And then you have 1.75. I hope you understand this. Look at it very well. You'd see. And so that's basically how it is. So even if you measure 21 inches, no matter the amount of inches that you measure, that's basically how the measuring tape is calibrated. Now that we understand the calibration of the measurement tape, we can then go ahead to learn about measurements. But before I continue, let me just give you a bit of a tip. You must have often heard people say 1 yard, 1 yard. And as a beginner, you might be wondering how many inches makes 1 yard. It's very simple. 36 inches makes 1 yard. So if you want to measure 1 yard from a material, you measure 36 inches on the self edge. Now, the self edge of a fabric is that part of the fabric that, has that rough edge. For lace fabrics, Yoruba people call it etiaje. For Ankara fabrics, is that portion where you have the name of the brand of the maker of the fabric. That's where you measure from. That's where you measure the yardage from, and not on the breadth of the fabric. So that's where you measure per yard. And then when they say, oh, it's by 60 or by 45, what they mean is, okay, how wide is it? If you measure 36, how wide is it? If you are measuring from top to bottom, given that the edge is at the top and at the bottom. So at least that one gives you an idea of how to measure out your fabric. So when I tell you measure out 1 yard from your fabric, I'm telling you to take the fabric from the self edge and measure 36 inches along the self edge of the fabric, which is 1 yard. Half a yard would be 18 inches. That is 36 divided by 2. So I just thought to mention that so you can have that, somewhere for keeps. So regarding measurements, there are so many things you could measure, but for the purpose of this training, I'll keep it simple. I'll just list out the basic measurements that you need, and then I'm going to show you those areas in a dress form. The first measurement you will need is the shoulder measurement. After the shoulder measurement is the back half length. After the back half length is the bust circumference, then the waist circumference, the hip circumference, the front half length, the sleeve length, and the bicep. So you can measure more than this, but for the purpose of this training, I want to keep it simple. Every other measurement you need, I'll be giving to you in the course of the training as standard measurements that you can use so that things don't get complicated. I'm going to show you these areas in a dress form. So let's take a look at this dress form. This is the back view. This is the front view. Let's zoom in on the back view and take measurements. So the first measurement you need to take is the shoulder measurement from left to right or from right to left. On the edge, on the corner of the body, that's the shoulder measurement. You take it from left to right or from right to left. The next measurement you want to be taking after the shoulder measurement is the back half length. You take it from the neck at the back. There's a bone at the back. You can see where that finger is pointing. You take it down the spine. That's the length of the back, which is the back half length. So we go to the front view, and in the front view, we begin to measure the circumference of the bust, of the waist, and of the hip. You can see where the arrows are indicating. You measure round the highest point of the bust, waist, and hip. And when you're measuring, make sure that your measuring tape ends on the side. Don't end your measurements in the front at the back, by the side. Then afterwards, you can measure your sleeve length from the corner of the edge of the hand all the way down. And then afterwards, you can measure your bicep. That's round the sleeves, on the short elbow, and on the wrist. On those three levels, you measure round. Just measure the exact body measurements. When you want to cut, you can apply changes. Then we can zoom in on the front body so that we can get the front half length. So you can measure the front half length from your side neck point. You can see the finger pointing on the side neck point. You measure straight down, but you have to note that when you're measuring the front half length, ensure the tip climbs on your bust, because there's a breast in front and there's no breast at the back. So the front half length is supposed to be longer than the back half length. So make sure the tip is climbing on the bust and goes to the waist, the natural waistline where your waist cinches in naturally. So that's basically what you need to measure for now. Subsequently, I'll give you other measurements that you can use that are standard. But then we move into the area of dimensions. Now, talking about dimensions, when you have taken these measurements, how do you apply it? Now, there are three categories of application. And three categories here, what do I mean? There are measurements that when you need to apply it, you need to divide it into 4. There are measurements that when you need to apply it, you need to divide it into 2. And there are measurements that when you need to apply it, you need to use it as is. So, three categories. The first one is divide into 4. Second one is divide into 2. The third one is use as is. That is, you use it just as it is. Now, the measurements that you divide into 4 are measurements that you take around the body, like the circumference, the bust circumference, the waist circumference, and the hip circumference. When you want to apply it in cutting, you have to divide the measurements into 4 to be able to apply it when cutting. Now, the measurement you divide into 2 is the shoulder measurement. When you want to apply the shoulder measurement in cutting, you divide it into 2. And then the ones you use as is, any measurement that you measure as a lengthwise measurement, for example, the front half length and the back half length. These measurements are lengthwise measurements, so you use it as is. For example, also your sleeve length, you use it as is. Let me give you a simple example. Let's just say you take the bust circumference and the measurement of the bust circumference is 40. Now that 40 is divided by 4 because it's a bust circumference. You have to divide 40 by 4, which is 10 inches. So when you want to apply your measurements, when you're drawing your pattern, you won't use the whole 40, you use 10 inches. Let's just say, for example, you measure the shoulder to be 16 inches. When you want to apply in cutting, you don't use the whole 16 inches, you divide it into 2, that's 8 inches. And so that's what I mean by divide into 4, divide into 2, or use as is. The reason is because the body is bilaterally symmetrical. In other words, it means that what you have on the left is what you have on the right, and you have front and back. So when you measure circumference, when you measure around the body, you can divide it into four equal parts. You can divide it into four equal parts. So when you're cutting, you don't need to use the entire strip of the measurement. And so I thought it was very important for me to explain this. Now, the final portion of the introductory class, which is class 1A, is geometry. Now, geometry is basically understanding shapes, your circles, your rectangles, your squares, and your triangles, and your cone. A cone is a portion of a circle. So I think this is something that we should all be familiar with. So in the course of the training, I'll be making reference to different shapes, and I want to believe that you are all familiar with these shapes before this time. Okay, at this time we'll wrap up class 1A, and then in class 1B, I'm going to be physically showing you some body measurements, real time, just in case you want to measure yourself. Then I would also be showing you some needlework in class 1B. So let's go straight to class 1B.